The city of Albuquerque is reaching out to the public for stories and ideas on how to handle the difficult history of Indian boarding schools. This after the discovery of mass unmarked graves at an Indian school site in British Columbia last year. But what do we know about this history here at home? Actually, quite a bit, as correspondent Antonia Gonzalez learned when she sat down with UNM professor Theodore Jojola.
Dr. Jojola, welcome to New Mexico in Focus.
Hinuko Kimam, thank you very much for inviting me.
And you've done research on Indian boarding schools here in New Mexico. Can you share a little bit about what the purpose was for the Albuquerque Indian School?
Well, it really began when I was looking through some of the things that were passed down to be my family, and in particular this little collection of boxes that had these little stray photos and negatives. And as I was going through there was this beautiful picture that was taken in 1937 of my mom, who graduated from the Albuquerque Indian School, and she was with my aunt and with my grandmother. So it was really at that point that I kind of said to myself, gee, what was that all about? We had talked about things before, but I really didn't know the depth of what the history of the school was. And consequently, I was actually given a contract to put an exhibit together by the Museum of Albuquerque. And in that, I was able to conduct a series of interviews with alumni from the school, all of whom have passed away now. So I had that amazing opportunity to be able to talk to people firsthand about their experiences there.
And what were some of your findings from some of the former students there?
The findings were pretty much consistent along the sense that it really was a place that people really valued, and in a way it kind of took me a little off from the standpoint of the fact that most of the things that you hear about the Indian boarding school experience have been horrendous, and we need to acknowledge and embrace that. But on the other hand, the Albuquerque Indian School experience was much different for a whole bunch of historical reasons, but largely attuned to the fact that they did have a direct connection with many of the tribes that of whose children actually went there.
And there are students from pueblos, from other tribes here in the state, but also the Four Corners region. Were there students from other parts of the U.S. that attended the Albuquerque Indian School?
Yes, it was largely Pueblo, but that's because of the kind of regional influence of the school itself in terms of being situated and located here. But they recruited in Oklahoma, in Arizona. There were many different kinds of tribes, especially at its earliest origin. But by and large, it really was serving mainly the Pueblos, and then beginning in the 60s, largely as a result of the impact of Johnson O'Malley, there was a Navajo component that was attached to it. So in that case, a lot of the Navajo children that were brought into the city were actually going to the Albuquerque public school system, but they were boarded there at the Albuquerque Indian School, and they actually maintain kind of like two campuses side by side.
And now currently the city of Albuquerque is working with the Native community and tribes in the Four Corners on the burial site, which is located at 4-H Park near the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. What has your research found about the burial site?
Well, sometime in the 1970s, for some reason that has still to really be clarified, a parcel of the campus was actually given over to the city, about 7 acres. And I think by and large, a lot of that was used to re-engineer the street there at 12th and Indian School. And as a consequence of that, there was this little triangle park that was created, which is about 2.5 acres. And it was within that where these early Indian burial sites are located.
And so the research that the city is looking for is going to include and make sure that the Native community is part of that. Why is that important to have tribes and Native community members involved?
Well, the biggest thing, of course, is just the fact that they need to acknowledge the Native children that are buried there. And right at this point, nobody knows who exactly was buried there. There was documentation that existed at one point, but unfortunately we think that ledger that existed of these burials and the information there burned as part of the catastrophes that occurred in the campus when the buildings were burning down there as well too. So nobody's quite sure who it is that was buried there. But from what we can find in terms of just general evidence, a lot of those burials occurred right around the 1930s.
And what are some of the concerns that people in the community are raising, especially to care for it in a proper cultural way?
Right. So, of course, it's now the city property. And I think that this, in a way, is kind of raising some awareness in the general urban Indian population about how this, in a way, represents some of the kind of untold legacy of the impact of the Indian boarding system. And in particular, it's been very different by the kind of Indian boarding school in the region from where the boarding school was situated. I think the most atrocious examples of this exist in Canada, where the residential schools in particular have just shown this horrendous kind of situation where many of the children were buried as a result of abuse. And in the case of the Indian boarding school, however, many of those children probably passed away as a result of diseases that they caught. From what we can reconstruct, many of these were really at the time when there was a lot of epidemics like influenza, Spanish flu, all in numbers of those types of things. And it should be also added that, this is not the only site where Indian burial exists for these children. The Albuquerque Indian School, very early in its inception, way back in the 1890s, contracted the Fairview Cemetery, where they laid out 73 plots. And in those, there are some early records. They're not complete, but it did show evidence of the fact that children passed away there as a result of diseases, and that many of them came from places like Navajo, Ute, other at that time, places that were relatively isolated. And as a consequence of that, the people at that time were not able to actually transport the children back to their home communities.
And what do you see needs to be done in that area, or some of the recommendations that you would offer need to happen at the 4-H site?
Well, I think the biggest issue is just how has this area been recognized, and in particular, how to bring this sense of the sacred back into that landscape. Because right now, of course, it's just sown with grass. One of the things that is a point of hurt is the fact that when the city put the park in there and then they began to do the excavations for the sprinkler systems, they basically desecrated many of the graves without any acknowledgement and attendance to being able to acknowledge and protect the grave sites that were there. And then to this day, it's basically carpeted over, so nobody knows the extent of what the burial site is and how many children are actually buried there. By some estimates, people think it's around 30 or 40, but nobody really knows for sure.
And in general, when it comes to surveying a site, zoning, planning, and when we talk about Indian burial sites or even just artifacts or anything of that sort, how is that different or handled differently by cities, and should they be consulting with tribes, especially if they're in an area where there is a known cultural site among the tribal nations?
Sure, absolutely. I think you have to look at it from the perspective of if these were children that were buried from the white population, they would have a much different reaction than the children that are there. And largely it kind of is probably invested in just some of the racism and also the notion that Indian people somehow were artifacts in order to be studied, and that of itself is really demeaning from the standpoint of why it is that this site is neither acknowledged nor protected. Really, the only thing that signifies the site is a very small plaque that exists there, and that was done, I believe, right at the time when the park itself was issued, and there's really not even a demarcation of that particular area. So people are wondering, why is it that people are allowed to walk on it? Is there some solution that essentially will acknowledge this and keep it separated as hallowed ground? Is that the sort of right way in order to be able to handle how it is that people would build a respect around it? But in a way, it's probably less about the individuals that are actually buried there, but the fact that this really, in a sense, is something that identifies Native people in general, and in a sense acknowledges the kind of legacy of what the Indian boarding school itself had early formulated in terms of really committing and changing our people into what was called by the outside as the other. So from that particular standpoint, then in a way, the burials are important and need to be acknowledged, but also the history needs to be learned by everybody so that they understand what has happened and what has occurred in terms of successive generations, in terms of this kind of impact of the post, I guess if you want to call it, territorialism of when this kind of education really impacted our communities.
And so what's next with the city and getting the public involved and recommendations? What's next for the burial site?
Well, they've had a series of listening sessions. I know that they've formed a commission within the city in order to kind of oversee and begin to solicit these recommendations about what might be solutions or what might be ways in order to be able to bring that story to bear. Right now it's still in the process of discussion. I know that they've also reached out to various tribes, probably the ones that are whose children are actually buried there, in order to be able to get that consultation going about, you know, how they would like to either do their own ceremony or pay respect to that particular area, as well as get input on what this place might be transformed into.
Dr. Hohola, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, well, thank you very much.